I want to talk about the Charlie Kirk assassination. I'm not here to defend every single thing he said, and I'm not here to condemn him. Obviously, I find it a horrible thing to see a man assassinated in front of his children. And apparently, not everybody feels that way. In fact, about half the country doesn't feel that way. But what I'm most interested in is where this leaves us on the path to an American Civil War, the second one. About a year ago, I put out a video about how civil wars start from a data science perspective and how AI is going to affect the outcome of this one. So this is going to be a sequel to that, with our experience and new knowledge 1 year later. And I'm also going to talk about how advances in technology are going to affect how events will turn out. So first I'm going to go to the mathematical modeling of civilizational stress, because that can explain a lot of what I think people are feeling right now in a more data-based way. So the first author I would look at is Peter Turchin, and his framework for predicting societal instability is really brutal in its simplicity in a way. He tracks what he calls secular cycles, which are these long waves of societal rise and fall that span centuries. They're like civilizational heartbeats, with each lasting about 200 to 300 years. Within these cycles, societies move through predictable phases of expansion, then stagflation, sort of economic stagnation and inflation as growth slows, and then crisis as the basic structures of society break, and then a depression period before a rebirth. Now, according to his calculations, America entered our crisis phase around 2010 after the economic collapse, the crash. What I admire about him is that he comes up with a lot of metrics and looks through the historical record for a lot of metrics. So, for example, he looks at the age of first marriage for men. Once that number gets above 28, bang, there's always a war. In the United States, it's now 31. He also looks at other metrics, and all these things go back to basically inequality. So inflation becomes a tool for driving inequality. And if any of you are interested in real estate investment, you'll probably, if you've done enough of it, you understand that inflation is the real driver of wealth. So a person does real estate investment, they put 10% cash down on a house. In the United States, you can do that, maybe 20%. And then the remaining, the 80%, is all debt. Now the tenant pays payments on that debt. The tenant services the debt, and inflation wipes away the debt over time. So if you took out a $100,000 mortgage 20 years ago, the house is probably worth $500,000 or $600,000 today because of the massive inflation that we've gone through. And it'll be worth more in a few years because inflation basically destroys the value of the dollar, so therefore it destroys the value of the debt. In human terms, what's happening is that there's one person who is going to work every day and putting their money away just into rent and not building any equity. So that money, goes into rent and it's gone. And at the same time, another person, the real estate investor, is collecting all of that equity that had the tenant been able to buy a house would be collecting itself. And so you can see how this is a means of transferring wealth, but this happens throughout the economy. So this is what Turchin refers to as the wealth pump, where their systems and processes get set up to extract wealth from the working classes, from people, lower income individuals, and move that wealth up the ladder to higher income individuals. Okay, so that was an aside. The other frameworks, because there are three pillars. The second pillar that leads to societal collapse is elite overproduction, with too many credentialed people competing for too few elite positions. This is what pushes wages down. This doesn't just hurt the lower classes, this tends to hurt the educated. And this creates counter elites, which is frustrated aspirants, people who are channeling popular discontent to challenge the existing order. Now, what did Charlie Kirk represent? Free markets. He wasn't such an economist, though. It was mostly family stability and religion, which are sort of the existing structure of society. And the numbers of these frustrated elite aspirants today are pretty staggering. About 48% of college graduates work in jobs that don't actually require degrees. And if you look at basically any major with a studies at the end of it is going to be a major or a degree that wouldn't need a college education in the first place to get a job. So the third pillar is fiscal distress. America's debt to GDP ratio hit about 120% in 2025. And interest payments alone are consuming $1 trillion every year. Now, the only way to pay for this, the only way to cover this debt, because obviously you can't tax 120% of the year's earnings, is through massive inflate away the debt to nothing. Same way you do with your mortgage. But none of this is all explaining the data side of things, but none of this is explaining the feeling that has permeated the country over the last week. I think a lot of people were shocked by the shooting, and then I see a lot of people who were not, who were expecting something like this. I would say that there's a big generational divide, and this has a lot to do with the inequality of earnings. So I'm familiar with many boomers who own 10, 15 real estate properties and are comfortably retired and living it up. And then you have these people coming out of college who have no hope of ever buying a house, and therefore no hope of ever starting a family. The marriage rates have imploded. That's why that number of age of first marriage is increasing, but also there's a lot of people who just cannot get married. Now, we chalk a lot of this up to cultural changes, maybe to feminism, maybe to just a change in people's priorities, but really there's a basic mindset, there's a basic biological drive in human beings to reproduce. And I'm not just talking about like sex. I'm saying people naturally want to have offspring. And the same way that when people are starving, they will do horrible things that they would never dream of doing when they're well fed. There's just different mindsets that come out in different conditions. And so when people are unable to have children for financial reasons, they're looking at the system and they're saying, I'm just going to burn it down. Let's roll the dice and see what comes out of it. So you're seeing in the younger generation, there's just fuel for this fire that's burning. So also another cycle is the turning cycle that Neil Howe talks about in his book, The Four Turnings. And now it's like his new book is The Fourth Turning is Here. He plots out how every 84 years, there's a crisis that's so huge it requires a full mobilization. So the previous one was obviously World War II. But 84 years before that, you had the American Civil War. 84 years before that, or 74 years, right? 77 years ago is what Lincoln said. But in about that time range, you had the American Revolution. And these are crises that require people to come together and build new structures just to survive. People realize that if we don't pull ourselves together, we're done. And so based on all of this, we could conclude we're right up on that 84 years. It'd be 2028 should be a really, really bad year to be in the United States. So there's this fuel for a fire, and it's looking for a spark, especially among the Gen Z cohort, just based on my own personal looking at Facebook, looking at the percentages of Americans who are either espouse racist or anti-Semitic views or just not normative American behaviors. We've understood it until now. There's this huge swing with Gen Z towards the crazy side, let's say. So where are we right now? Well, a lot of people are comparing the assassination, at least on the right, are comparing the assassination to the assassination of Martin Luther King. I mean, obviously these are two very different people with different politics, but from the perspective I see on the right, people are saying, oh, he was conciliatory, he would go out and talk to people, Charlie Kirk was empathetic toward other people, would listen to their arguments and talk to them and try to make connections with people. Much like Martin Luther King Jr. came from the Black community and was coming to white Americans with a message of not so much peace. He believed in nonviolent protest. He was trying to show Americans how they weren't living up to who they thought they were. He's saying, you aren't the people you think you are. Now, the assassination of Martin Luther King did not lead to a civil war in the United States. There were race riots after that, but the reality was that the conditions of African Americans in the United States was getting better and better and better over time. Since about the 1970s, it's been getting worse and worse and worse. But at that time, the fuel wasn't on the fire. A lot of this has to do with how we interpret events. So events that might lead to a horrible war in one condition would lead to very limited reaction under separate conditions. So this shooting, you could say, well, we had a lot of assassinations in the past. In the past year, we've had many assassinations. But the fuel is ready for a spark. Now, when I think back to previous turnings and looking at today's events, what this reminds me most of was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. He was making a desperate attempt to ignite a slave rebellion that would spread across the South and end slavery through an armed insurrection. Now, again, I'm not making moral comparisons between John Brown and either Charlie Kirk or the shooter. I'm just pointing out something that will make sense in a minute. So Brown was a radical abolitionist, and he had already gained notoriety because of his actions in Bleeding, Kansas, where different gangs and factions were murdering each other to determine whether or not Kansas would become a slave state or a free state. Now, the raid collapsed when a local militia, which was led by federal troops under the command of Robert E. Lee, surrounded Brown's forces. They killed a bunch of his men and they captured him. Within 36 hours, what Brown thought was going to be a spark for this huge uprising turned into this military disaster, and it left him wounded, and he was facing charges of treason. In the North, reactions to Brown's capture and execution showed a lot of very deep fissures within the anti-slavery movement and within America broadly. So even moderate Republicans, which would include Abraham Lincoln, condemned Brown's methods, but they sympathized with his goals. Their argument was that violence would only harm the anti-slavery cause and provide ammunition for Southern extremists. Does this remind you of any Facebook comments or social media comments that you've seen recently about this assassination? Now, the more radical abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Theodore Parker said that Brown was a martyr, and Ralph Waldo Emerson declared that Brown's execution would make gallows as glorious as the cross. On the day he was hung, church bells were tolling across New England and prayer meetings were held, and Henry David Thoreau delivered speeches comparing Brown to Christ. This lionization of Brown sent shockwaves through the South, and it convinced a lot of Southerners that the Republican Party, despite its official policy of nonviolence, was secretly in league with violent abolition. The Southern reaction was very swift and unified and horrified. They saw Brown's raid as a confirmation of their worst fears about Northern intentions and about the ultimate goals of the anti-slavery movement. Southern newspapers said that Brown's actions were the true face of abolitionism, and they argued that Republicans who claimed to oppose only slavery's expansion actually supported its violent overthrow everywhere. And this was the beginning of the secessionist movement, where Virginia Governor Henry Wise used Brown's raid to argue for immediate secession, and Southern politicians started demanding federal protections for slavery, and they accused Republicans of endorsing domestic terrorism. Do you see where I'm going with this? I think that this is a really crystallizing moment from everything I'm seeing online. I really haven't seen a lot of sympathy from the left for Charlie Kirk, that's for sure. And on the right, people are starting to freak the F out. The politicians are still trying to call, some of them are still calling for calm. I'm going to show you a clip of AOC and what she had to say. It was part of a longer thing about gun control, which always comes out whenever one of these shootings happens. But I want you to look at her and tell me what you think.
This is horrific. This is awful. And the assassination of Charlie Kirk risks an uncorking of political chaos. Are we going to do something, or are we going to argue over rhetoric? That is my question about this. We have to pass gun safety legislation and stop this.
So what I picked up on most from that was just fear in her eyes. She's never been the brightest lamp in the room, but I think she picks up on the fact that she is now at a much higher level of risk. And that's what I took from that. It was the boilerplate on gun control, but in reality, if there's a civil war, that's not going to help. Now, on the right, what are we seeing? I think the most poignant was a piece put up by Nick Freitas, and I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to talk about what it means.
Let's jump to that real quick, just so everyone has context of what I'm talking about. So I'll read this off. It said, I am told that as a state representative, this is the moment where I'm supposed to express my heartfelt condolences and then stand in solidarity with those on the other side of the aisle as we condemn political violence and stand unified as one people. But we aren't one people, are we? The truth is we haven't been for some time now, and there is really no point in pretending anymore if there ever was. We are two very different peoples. We may occupy the same piece of geography, but that is where the similarities seem to abruptly end. I convinced myself for a long time that whenever the left called me a racist, a bigot, a sexist, a fascist, a threat to democracy, for even the most innocent of disagreements, that it was simply hyperbolic rhetoric done for effect. And now the effect is a widow and 2 orphaned children because the left couldn't bear the thought of a peaceful man debating them and winning. I don't think they realize it yet, but murdering Charlie is going to be remembered as the day where we finally woke up to what this fight really is. It is not a civil dispute among fellow countrymen. It's a war between diametrically opposed worldviews which cannot peacefully coexist with one another. One side will win and one side will lose. Charlie tried to win that fight through argumentation, through discussion, through peaceful resolution of differences, and the other side murdered him.
And I'd say that pretty much sums it up. We now have 2 different countries living inside the same border. There are lots of different factions, but we're at a point where people are saying, I can't even live in the same physical space as those guys over there. So, yes, there've been calls for calm. Don't do what Charlie wouldn't want you to do. But realistically, I think the cat's out of the bag. The ship has sailed. From the comments I see online, there's so much hatred that there's no way to put this broken egg back together. And it's all happening right on schedule, right like Turchin said, right like the 4th turning is supposed to be happening. Right now, it's happening. So this is being interpreted very differently from previous political assassinations. Really is a crystallizing moment for people deciding what side of this thing that's coming on. What surprises me about all this? Well, it was obvious around 2022, just based on Turchin's number, that we were heading straight for a civil war or a major conflict with another country. I mean, remember the Second World War, the country was tearing itself apart until Japan bombed the United States, bombed Pearl Harbor. And then it's like, oh, now we've got an external enemy to go after. And it really pulled the country together and built a unity of the sort that really nobody had experienced. And if you talk to the older generation, I still have some relatives from that time who are alive. The one thing they always bring up is how unified, how together we all were at that time. It's like something they haven't felt ever since, maybe a few days after September 11th. What surprises me about this is the brazenness of the comments that I see online. People are posting comments about how much they hated Kirk, how much they're glad to see what happened happen. And I'm just thinking, do you not know what age living in? So let's suppose that the conservative side of the political spectrum is the Nazi, fascist, racist, imperialist, aggressor, blah, blah, blah. That is always, it's the standard accusation that was used to justify this assassination in the first place. Okay, so if that's true, why would you leave a permanent record of holding a fanatical position on Facebook? Like, let's say 2 years down the road, we're living in a full-on internal war situation. Probably not going to look like the first American Civil War if you're watching this a few years from now. It's going to look a lot more like the Troubles in Ireland, with different factions and gangs, a lot of killings and bombings, and just a lot of back and forth fighting, but not by organized armies, at least at first. And as the central government tries to regain control, they're going to want to track down people that they believe to be instigating whatever actions are being fought against their side. Who's in control right now? Who has control over every lever of government? Now, with one keystroke, if I have the data from social media, I could look at exactly a list of names of all the people who are fanatical for this particular side. With 2 keystrokes, you could probably locate their geographic location where they made the comment. With 3 keystrokes, you could link it up to their cell phone, and with 4 keystrokes, you could figure out exactly where they are right now. Not that I would do that, but I'm just saying, as a data scientist, that is a very easy thing to do. Facebook isn't just going to be recommending new flavors of cheese or the garden gazebo from Costco anymore. It's going to be a tool of war. It's going to be a situation where you leave an incendiary comment today, forget about it, and then in 3 or 4 years, there's a knock at the door by men with masks. So the only thing that I could see preventing this, I think it's too late to pull back from the brink. If there was some external attack, like a Pearl Harbor type event, that might galvanize the country together to go after one external enemy. I don't think that's going to happen, though, just because of demographic collapse. it's very hard to field an army when you have this huge population of elderly people. So if that's going to happen, better happen soon. What do you think? Am I completely off my rocker? Or is this something that you're feeling too? Leave a comment.